The federal government says it's going to stop advertising on Facebook and Instagram. It's a direct response to Meta's decision to block Canadian news content on the platforms. At the center of the dispute, the Online News Act. The CBC's Rafi Boudjikanian reports.
After Google and Meta dug in their heels, a show of force from the federal government.
It can be intimidating, but are we going to let ourselves be intimidated?
Some $10 million in public money a year gone for Meta, the company running Facebook and Instagram. The latest salvo in an ongoing escalation since the government passed Bill C-18 last month with support from the opposition NDP and Bloc Québécois. The Online News Act would force Google and Meta to pay news organizations like the CBC every time a user lands on a news story online through using their services. Both have threatened to pull Canadian news links off their pages.
We're continuing constructive conversations with Google. Unfortunately, Facebook has just refused to recognize any sort of responsibility it might have.
Une personne sur deux au Québec ne verra plus les nouvelles.
And others are acting too. Cogeco, one of two media players in Quebec today to announce it is also pulling ads from Meta.
When you think about the whole industry, in Canada, it's 80% of digital revenue goes to Google and Meta. So, I mean, there must be some money for us.
The government's had warnings that tech giants would not play ball with the law, both from the companies themselves and from the federal Conservatives.
Google and Meta, otherwise known as Facebook and Instagram, have responded. And as a result, it's Canadians who have gotten harmed in the crossfire.
With Google saying it's willing to talk to the government about pending regulations, some observers have hope and questions.
What would a sharing kind of agreement look like? How can this really benefit, Canadian journalism? How can we strengthen, journalistic practice in Canada?
Showing just how hard it may be to get a snowball effect going, Trudeau's own political party, the Liberals, are not cutting ads on Facebook. Meta's revenues last year alone exceeded $116 billion, and so far it's given no indication it will change course on blocking Canadian news. Rafi Boudjikanian, CBC News, Ottawa.
And we are learning this hour that CBC will also be pausing ads from Facebook and Instagram amid the ongoing fight with the online news bill. Now, there are questions surrounding what the future holds for Canadian news on these platforms and if the decision to stop government advertising will help sway any tech companies. Shruti Shaker is a tech reporter and managing editor for Android Central. She shared her thoughts on the government's move.
I'm not surprised that the government did this. I think it is the right for the government to do something like this, especially because, as Mr. Trudeau has stated, he feels that the big tech are bullies and are pushing back and not complying with what the federal government wants. So rightfully so, of course, the government is going to push back. Now, will this entice the big tech to come to the table? It's unclear, at least with Meta. They seem to be very hell-bent on not wanting to come forth and try to comply. Their statement or stance is that they are not a news aggregator. They are a social media company, which is, to an effect, very different than what Google provides in terms of its search and being able to aggregate news. So will Meta come? I really do hope, because if they don't come and this comes into a block in effect and users are not able to look on Facebook and Instagram for news, I think it will be very problematic for Canadians, but hopefully they will come to some sort of conversation at least.
I mean, it doesn't sound like it right now, right? Because they do say in that statement that we just received that, that they plan on complying by ending news availability in Canada in the coming weeks. Now, the legislation doesn't come into effect for 6 months, but can you see this sort of playing out sooner rather than later with, the entrenched positions between the government and Meta?
Absolutely. I would not be surprised if Meta tries to pull the trigger and do something like this sooner rather than later, which is why I'm a little hopeful that the conversation around with Google is still on the table. there is a possibility that if the government is able to come to some sort of consensus with Google, then Meta can kind of see what Google has done and kind of piggyback on it, or at least come to the table to try and, you know, mitigate or try to fix what's happened. But up until that point, I don't see Meta backing down anytime soon. And I think this fight is going to be pretty strong. Meta has been pretty strong on its stance for quite some time now.
That's tech reporter Shruti Shaker. Now, Canada is not the first country to do this. Australia passed landmark legislation back in 2021 that forced tech giants to pay for the news content shared on their platforms. So what lesson can Canada learn from Australia, and how are news organizations benefiting from the deal Australia reached with big tech? To break this down for us, I'd like to bring in Rob Nichols. He's an associate professor of regulation and governance at the University of New South Wales, and we've reached him live in Sydney. Good morning to you, and thank you for taking the time. So, Rob, can you compare and contrast the two legislations for us?
So the big difference between the two is that in Australia, there was a capability for the minister to designate platforms that didn't actually come to deals with the news organisations. And the first two were logically going to be Meta and Google. But the designation has never happened, because in Australia, each of Google and Facebook actually did deals with the major media companies. And so there's never been a need to actually use the law. So the law was in place, but never actually used. That doesn't mean we didn't have the same effects that Meta is threatening in Canada now. For a week, Facebook blocked access to what it said were news media sites, but that included Facebook.com, domestic violence helplines, and many state authorities.
So that's all very interesting. So how difficult do you think of a task it will be for Canada to force these companies to pay for news if it actually reaches that stage?
Well, I think that Google has shown that it's actually happy to pay a certain amount for news, but it wants to do it in a commercial way. That is, not having to report how much is being paid, and for the news organisations not having to report how they spend it. Meta makes a different argument. It says that news isn't as important to Meta's business model than it is to Google's business model. So it's happier not to have news content on its sites. So I think getting a deal with Google is a lot easier than getting a deal with Meta.
What did Australia do that made both Meta and Google come to the negotiating table, reach a deal, and why do you think it's never had to kind of been used?
Because the threat from the legislation was quite extensive, so a requirement to come to terms and to have ultimately arbitration, and a very specific sort of arbitration called final offer arbitration, where the news company on one side and the platform on the other says, this is our final deal, and the arbitrator chooses between one or the other, nothing in between. So actually it encouraged negotiation between the news businesses and the platforms. And the fact that legislation didn't need to be used was important. So each side could say, we did a commercial deal. We're not going to tell the government or anybody else what that commercial deal was. And whether the money goes to journalisms or to executive bonuses didn't have to be revealed either. And that's quite important for both sides here, that you do a deal in private just the same way you'd normally do a commercial deal.
So, Rob, what kind of lessons do you think Canada can learn from Australia, or is it not a perfect, is it more like apples and oranges?
I think the big difference is that Australia has Antarctica to the south, whereas you have the US, and the influence of Canadian decisions on actions in the US is a lot closer because of geography. So I think there's a bigger concern from each of the two platforms that potentially Washington could have a much closer eye on Ottawa than it would having a look at what happens in Canberra in Australia. So I think that geographical proximity means you can't take the Australian example and apply it in Canada. But I think the idea of getting to a threat but not a requirement for the law to be enacted was quite an important thing. I think the fact that Google settled early is also an interesting lesson.
Rob, thank you. Good to talk to you. Rob Nichols is an associate professor of regulation and governance at the University of New South Wales. We reached him live in Sydney.